Okay, well, welcome once again to my library here in the United States on the East Coast. We have been going through a number of different theories, different ideas concerning how Islam began, how Muhammad, whether or not he did exist in the 7th century, whether or not the Quran is a book that was revealed in the 7th century or came about in the 8th century, and where this all happened. You've known that I've been bringing on different people to talk about it. I've been bringing Mel from Sneakers Corner. I've also brought on Joe from Red Judaism. And I've brought on Murad from the Middle East. It's now we're going to bring on someone new. This man is a friend of Mel and Joe, who has been introduced to me to bring up another idea, another theory. And it is a theory, and this is, I've been told, this is what we call a green paper. A green paper is what the parliamentary system uses. This is the something that just to get theories out there, and then they make it into a white paper, which is the proposal, which then they go public with. In some ways, we're jumping to the white paper, where we're putting out a proposal here, but Paul wants me to call this a green paper. And I'm fine with that. Now, Paul and I don't always agree on everything. We're understandable. We're coming up with so much new material. We're trying to fit it into the 7th century. We've always said that we do not trust the 9th and 10th century traditions, which are just too late. 9th and 10th century is 200 to 300 years too late. And we don't trust what they say about how Islam began, who Muhammad was, where it all happened, and how the Quran was brought into being. So we've asked that everybody go back to the 7th century. Now, Paul has done just that, and Paul is a researcher. He has been researching there in London, in England. He has been researching for the last 3 years, looking at an entirely new thesis. This is the thesis that Mel and I introduced, about a week or more ago, concerning the Jerusalem thesis. And I think, Paul, I'll bring him on just in a minute, I think he would call it that. This is the idea that much of what we know concerning how Islam began, concerning the Hajj and the practices and some of the beliefs, and also even some of the people and places, did not occur down in the south in Mecca, Medina, but occurred much, much further north. And we can find antecedents to that if we just look and unpack the Bible itself and just look and see what was happening both theologically and politically on the ground. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Paul. Paul, how are you? Are you there?
I'm fine, thank you. Hello, Jay.
There you are.
May I start by embarrassing you and saying thank you very much for all the work that you've done in this area over the last heaven knows how many years. I first became aware of you, I think 4 or 5 years ago, watching one of your videos, and it sparked an interest that has changed my life and taken over the last 3 years of my life. And I just want to thank you very much for all the work that you've done in this area.
Well, listen, Paul, thank you for actually coming on board. And thank you also for introducing something we have not we've surmised, we've guessed at, we didn't know what to think about it. I was excited when Mel brought it up to my attention. Joe earlier had brought another area that you're going to bring up to my attention. But I think what you have done, and this is why I like bringing people like you on board, because what you're going to do, you've got a PowerPoint. By the way, congratulations on how nice and colorful your PowerPoint is. The colors you have, the way you put it together, I'm jealous. I wish I could do the same thing that you're doing. But you're going to introduce.
I'm an ex-teacher, Jay, and
okay, so
and I think in PowerPoint. I think in PowerPoints now. I could hardly think without thinking how I put it onto a PowerPoint.
I tell you, I use PowerPoint so I don't go off on different tangents. It keeps me centered to what I need to be talking about. Listen, we don't want to spend any more time. I really want people to hear what you're saying. So why don't I'll just give it right over to you. I'm just going to let you talk. I may come in here and there just to help people understand, because sometimes when people I bring on board, they go so quick and they say things that maybe need to be defined or understood. So I may jump in at some point just to make sure that the audience follows where you're going with it. But other than that, I'm just going to let you go, and I'm going to take notes here. This will be one of the first times I've heard this. I'm going to take notes, and then I'm going to come back and try to summarize at the end what you've said. And then we'll have a quick discussion to see the implications of this, because I think what you're coming up with is exciting. I'm not going to agree with everything you say, Paul. Okay, just to put that out there. There are some things I don't think. There's just something that's one of the great things about this. We can continue to disagree, and yet I love your thesis, and I love your intellect, and I love your excitement, and I love your enthusiasm for just this subject. Good on you. All right, over to you, and I'll let you introduce your own PowerPoint.
Right, a little bit of self-promotion first. I've adopted the title Islam Research Group. I've got a website with some material on, which anyone is free to look at. And if anyone wants to contact me at the end of this, you can contact me through that website. I plan a YouTube site. I've reserved the title called Islam Research Group, but I haven't actually made any videos yet. But it'd be great if anyone could remember that and maybe pop by in a few weeks' time. I've also been writing a book called Read the Quran Through 100 Themes. It's going to be a very long book. I think Mel mentioned it in an interview on this channel a couple of weeks ago. It takes the Quran and it divides most of the verses, every verse that really contains relevant material, into 100 different themes. So make it very easy to read or to follow a particular idea. So if you'd want to look and see what the Quran says about hell, or what it says about inheritance law, or what it says about Noah, you would just go straight to that theme and see all the verses there. And it's got plenty of commentary, some of my own theories in there.
Paul, let me just jump in here at this point. Mm-hmm. You will see that as you go through the slideshow. One of the things that I was impressed by is that Paul does and has gone right through the Quran, has pulled out these different themes. It's because he's able to do that with this book that he's putting together, that he's come up with so much of this new material that you're going to hear now. So in some ways, what you're going to do next is an application of just this very thing, these themes. It's because you have pulled out these themes, you've been able to then find where the antecedents are to them.
Great. Now, before I launch into my theme, I'll just, in the spirit of no surprises, Jay is correct. Jay, you are correct that we don't agree on everything. So I'll just set out my basic parameters right at the very outset. We won't agree, and we don't want to get bogged down into an undignified squabble over it, but so far my assessment is three areas where we really don't agree. Is one, I think that the Quran was largely complete, if not entirely complete, by the mid-7th century, based on the carbon dating. We're not going to agree about that. We'll come back. Secondly, I think it was largely the work of one person. I have some areas where I think it's quite clear that somebody who didn't understand what the original author said has come along and messed around with it and put bits in that don't fit. But largely, I believe it was a work of one person. And thirdly, I think it was a person who went by the name of Muhammad. I think it was a guy who adopted the name Muhammad for his own use, but we'll come up to that in the slide. So with those three, just so that people know where I'm coming from, so I don't catch anyone by surprise when I seem to be adopting
one other area
of the traditional narrative.
One other area we disagree. You believe that Muhammad could have been living in Yathrib in the Hijaz. That we would disagree upon as well.
Yes, Yathrib existed then. It's mentioned in the Quran. It's mentioned in some non-Muslim sources, like the common Syriac source. So I see no reason to disbelieve in it. So I accept that, but it doesn't really play a major part in today's presentation. He could have been somewhere else for these purposes. Right. So what does the Quran tell us about the Masjid al Haram? I have identified six attributes of this place in the Quran. First of all, it is referred to as a house. It's either the house or sometimes the sacred house. On one occasion, the ancient house, which could be important. Also as God's house. So it's described as a house. Secondly, it's described in Surah 3, verse 96 as the first house at Mecca. Twice in Surah 5, it is referred to as the Kaaba, which we think means the cube. So we're told that it's cube-shaped. Twice also it is referred to as the station or the standing place of Abraham. And Surah 2 tells us that it is a place that was assigned for Abraham by God. That is where Abraham and Ishmael raised the foundations of the house. And it's somewhere where Abraham settled his progeny nearby. Fifthly, we are told that it is the destination of a pilgrimage called the Hajj. And we are also told in relation to that, that this pilgrimage involves rituals such as circumambulation, walking around something, and also animal sacrifice. And finally, the sixth thing that we are told about the Masjid al Haram is the Hajj pilgrimage involves going between two places that are named as Safa and Marwa. Well, this is what the Quran tells us. The Quran introduces the Masjid al Haram, and these are all the things, all the clues, if you like, all the clues in the Quran to what places is meant by that.
All right.
So the Quran uses the name Masjid al Haram, but if you want to go behind the name, this is what we are told about it. These are the clues to try and locate where it is that the Quran author was talking about. Well, in the traditional narrative, Baka is simply another word for Makkah, which is where we get Mecca from. The change of the first letter from a B to an M is, I think, regarded as having no significance at all. It's just regarded as a variation. The reference to it being the first house is a reference to Adam and Eve and where Adam and Eve lived on earth after they were expelled from paradise. The reference to the station of Abraham, to it being built by Abraham and Abraham living nearby, is explained as Hagar taking Ishmael to the Hijaz as a baby, and years later Abraham visiting Ishmael and building a shrine with him. By that stage Ishmael was an adult. The Hajj pilgrimage, we are told, this is where the traditional narrative runs in, I think, to a little bit of a problem, because having told us that that the shrine was built by Abraham, it then has to tell us that it's a pilgrimage site of destination. So it has to have the local Arabs who've become corrupted by paganism or by polytheism. And so whereas the site was indeed a monotheistic Abrahamic shrine to begin with, it must have been corrupted because Muhammad then has to go to war to seize it and purify it.
Paul, what Muslims will say in response is that he rebuilt it. It was not that he originally built it. It was rebuilt by him and Ishmael.
Well, if they're raising the foundations, that sounds like it's that sounds to me a little bit as though they're starting from scratch, doesn't it? They must have done very little there. But this is after Abraham. In Muhammad's lifestyle, you don't like Muhammad. If in the Quran's time, the author of the Quran is talking about capturing or fighting to gain access to the Masjid al Haram. So it doesn't sound as though it's and he's fighting polytheists, the mushrikun or the associators. So it doesn't sound as though it's an Abrahamic shrine at the time that the Quran was being written. It was an Abrahamic shrine maybe at one stage, but it must have become corrupted, I guess they would say, by polytheism, and so has to be purified. That would, I guess, be the way that Muslims would see the outline of the story.
Yeah, and to be fair, they would agree that by the time the Quran was written in they would say 7th century, it had been corrupted. The polytheists had got into it. They had to be excised and thrown out. But they would still point back that Abraham was not the one that built it originally. He and Ishmael only rebuilt it
after Adam and Eve built the original.
That's right. It started with Adam and Eve. It has always existed, they would say.
Okay, but fine. And finally, going between Safa and Marwa, there's a tradition that this is Hagar looking for water, and she has to run between these two hills 7 times, looking for water, and she puts Ishmael down, baby Ishmael down somewhere between them, and then she goes from one to the other 7 times, looking and climbing them, looking around because of her desperate straits. I don't want to be mean and unfair, because in my view all religions involve believing in stories that may seem implausible. So I don't want to appear mocking. But I have to say that the traditional Islamic narrative isn't just implausible. It just doesn't seem to make sense to me. Mecca and Mecca makes the change of the initial, it seems to me, makes it a completely different word. It's not something that can simply be brushed over as being of no significance whatsoever. When you change the initial letter, you change the meaning of the word, it seems to me. I have a theory as to why there might be 2 places, one called Mecca and one called Mecca, but which might have to go into another time. But I don't think that one could just ignore it and say, well, they're obviously the same place. I can't think of any other 2 places in the world, in human history, where you would change the initial letter and it still be the same place. I don't know if you can.
Just to support what you're saying, Dr. Patricia Kruna also agrees with you, or you might be agreeing with her since she said it first. In 1987 and 1977, when she came out with Hagerism and also Meccan trade, she made this very point that you're making, that if those who are making this point do not understand Arabic, because Arabic always has 3 consonants. Every word has 3 consonants at its root, and a B and a M are completely 2 different consonants. And so therefore you cannot have an interchange like this that are so drastic. What she also says is Mecca is a place, as you've already mentioned. It is a place. It is up in Lebanon. The Mecca Valley is still there today. So it suggests that this is taking the biblical Mecca and confusing it with the sanctuary Mecca. You can't do that in Arabic unless you're not an Arabic speaker. And most of those who are bringing up this point that this is the same name are usually non-Arabic speakers, and they tend to come from the Indian subcontinent.
Yes. The suggestion that it's called the first house because it was built by Adam and Eve, it seems to me that that's just a fanciful explanation. Lots of places might be referred to as a first house without being built by built by the first humans. It just seems to me that that's overly literal as an attempt to find an explanation for the verse. It seems it's without any real foundation.
A Muslim will come back. Paul, a Muslim will come back to you on that and just say, if it's Adam and Eve, of course it's the first house. Who precedes Adam and Eve? What is more fanciful, I think, is this notion that, and this is a difficulty, I would say, that geography, when you look at the story where this is introduced in the traditions, they show that chapter 7, verse 24 of the Quran, where this is referred to, though it doesn't say, it just says that they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, which we now know is up in space, that Eve was thrown down to Mecca and Adam was thrown down to Kerala in southern India. And that he then strides, he's 90 meters tall, and he strides up from Kerala all the way up to Mecca and joins his wife there. Now, that would be a problem in and of itself. Now, you already said that many of these are fanciful. I would suggest that just the geography and the historical problems, to say nothing of the difficulty, how is it that God mistook Kerala for Mecca when he threw Adam there? These are all there's a theological problem there as well. But nonetheless, it's fanciful. It is fanciful. It's a great story. I wish I'd had that in Sunday school.
Yes. Yes, perhaps it's worth me reverting to what I said at the outset about my general approach to the Quran, which is I regard it at the moment. I believe that it was composed within the time scale that Islam would say it was composed. I think it was largely composed by the middle of the 7th century. I don't think it's jumbled up nonsense. I think the Quran has a meaning to it and a purpose to it. And I think that the more one looks at it, the more one analyzes it with the aid of modern scholarship and academics, I think the more meaning we can find within it. I think that the curse of Islam have been people quite early on giving it over literal interpretations. And so if it mentions the first house, oh, it has to be the house of Adam and Eve. That's a tip that seems to be the typical of just taking words out of any poetic context or any literary context and just giving it the most literal meaning possible. It just seems to be implausible. Related to Hagar taking Ishmael to the Hijaz, this would be, if she started off in the place that the Bible tells us, this would be an undocumented and completely unexplained 600-mile trip from Canaan, which would have been a very fertile land, to Hijaz, which is an Arab, it is Arab as well, but an arid desert. And I don't see any explanation as to why she should have made such a trip. Still more, how Abraham could have made a similar trip years later and found her. To me, again, this seems strange to beyond any reasonable belief.
Okay, I will jump back in this. What Muslims will say is this is not strange because Abraham was already living there. This is not 600 miles. He never lived in Canaan. Obviously, you can see a real problem with that. And we're not even going to get into, you've already mentioned that there's just nothing there in that part of the world. Why in the world would Abraham living there? But see, Muslims go even further than that. Muslims would say that Moses lived there, that all the prophets lived there, all the 19 prophets, biblical prophets that are mentioned in the Quran, they all lived that far south. So, I mean, getting into all the archaeological evidence we have for Canaan, for almost all the biblical prophets, that's just thrown out of the water. So you can see, historically speaking, archaeologically speaking, in almost every context, Muslims are going to have a problem persuading you and me that Abraham ever lived that far south.
See, Jay, I hadn't heard this before this evening. I must admit, I was under the impression that most Muslims accepted that Abraham lived in Canaan.
Okay.
But does that mean that Muslims...
Chapter 21 of the Quran. If you look at chapter 21 of the Quran, verse 51 to 71, Abraham goes into the Kaaba and he destroys all the idols there. He has to be living in Mecca to be able to do that. So therefore, what they assume and how they interpolate that is all of this takes place down there surrounding Mecca, what we know as the Hijaz today.
But would that not mean that Mount Moriah would have to be in the Hijaz, and that Solomon's temple and all that? Would Muslims believe that Solomon's temple is in Mecca? Because surely there must be some trace of that. How did the Romans destroy it? It seems to me that's a very hard proposition to maintain.
Paul, this is why we need to bring this to the fore. Most Muslims don't realize that if you're going to take the Quran at face value, if it's very clear that Abraham lived there, if it's very clear that Eve lived there, Eve is from the very beginning of time, Abraham is from 1900 BC, therefore there has to be a Mecca there in 1900 BC. Can you see how enormously implausible this is historically? To say anything to do with the whole history we know of the Bible that was way up 600 miles further north. They're going to have to bring all that history back down to one of the most deserted places on earth that has no vegetation, that has no water, and that has no history.
Yes. So I have to say I find that truly surprising that I wasn't aware of that. Okay. The original Abrahamic shrine, they would have to say, became a pagan shrine. So it was obviously monotheistic when Abraham built it, but then it became a pagan shrine later on through corruption. Again, this is, I don't need to labor the point, this is unsupported by any documentary or physical evidence. Nobody has ever recorded a pilgrimage shrine there. Nobody has found any evidence, a coin or a shard of pottery or two bricks, one on top of the other. Nobody's actually found anything that is claimed to date from the time of the Quran, and it's hard to see how that could have completely disappeared. And finally, the running between the two hills, I would say that this is the story. It's not even a matter of believing it or not believing it. It just doesn't seem to make any sense to me. If you're looking for water, you would try to look in as many places as possible. You wouldn't go backwards and forwards between two small hills 7 times. It seems quite an obvious waste of your energy in quite desperate circumstances. So, in a nutshell, I think that the traditional Islamic narrative has been constructed by people who have received the Quran, see what the Quran says about the Masjid al Haram, and have to explain all these verses. And they've tried to find an explanation that fits. I'm not suggesting that the Quran is particularly late, because these explanations are here to explain a text that has been inherited and that for whatever reason people can't make sense of or want to create an alternative narrative for. So I think we can put the traditional narrative to one side. All these attributes, on the other hand, perfectly fit the Jerusalem temple. The Jerusalem temple is referred to very many times in the Bible as the house of God. Jay, you will know this far better than me. But I believe it starts with Exodus chapter 25, when God commands Moses and says, let them construct a sanctuary for me that I may dwell amongst them. And then later on, the Israelites build a temple, and Solomon builds a temple, and that is frequently referred to in the Psalms, in the other books of the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, referred to throughout as the house of God. Would you agree with me on that, Jay?
Yeah, I mean that's. I mean, this is fascinating what you're doing. I'm sitting here because I don't think anybody has unpacked it like what you're doing right here. I've never seen anybody zero in on the Masjid al Haram like what you're doing here, and I'm fascinated because this is the first time, though Mel introduced it a week or two ago. The fact what you have come up with, Paul, looking at these different categories, these 6 categories in the house, you're going to talk about back in the cube. I think we need to reassess now where all of these seem to have been, where the antecedents for all these references that you've just gone through in the Quran. It looks like you're going to show us that almost every one of them, or all of them, can be found in the biblical text. This is exciting. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah. So, house of God, we know any religion may say, well, our temple is the house of God. There's not a particularly unusual thing to say within a religious context, but we know that the Bible does make this claim repeatedly for the house of God, and so if one said this within an Abrahamic or a Judeo-Christian context, people would think of the Jerusalem temple. That's where they would think of first. Mecca is referred to in the Bible. In Psalm 84, pilgrims to Jerusalem stop and gain refreshment in the valley of Mecca. So we know that there is perhaps a first house. I haven't done a complete exegesis of this, but maybe the first house at Mecca was the first house that one came to as one made the pilgrimage. I don't know, but it's the name Mecca certainly has a precedent within the Hebrew Bible. You don't have to say, oh, it's the same place as Mecca. The name has its own place. The cube. We are told in 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 20 that the Holy of Holies of Solomon's temple has a cubic shape. It is 20 cubits by 20 cubits by 20 cubits. It is a cube, and this replicates, I think, the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle in the wilderness. The same dimensions that are in 1 Kings are also used by Ezekiel when he describes a heavenly temple that he sees, and even the New Jerusalem, which is described in the book of Revelation, is also, I think, a cubic, or at least it's got a square base and it's as high as it is wide and long, which sounds like a cube. So if someone says it is a cube, that fits the Jerusalem temple very well. I think it would be recognized as referring not to the whole of the temple, but to the Holy of Holies, the most important part of it. Sorry, I'll have to move the little screen again. we are told in the Bible that Abraham was told to sacrifice Isaac on a mountain in Moriah that would be pointed out to him by God. That is in Genesis chapter 22. And we are also told that Solomon built a temple on the same site, and that's in there it's described as Mount Moriah in 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1. So when the Quran tells us that the Masjid al Haram was built on foundations that had first been raised by Abraham, this fits with the Jerusalem temple. There is an issue on Ishmael, because Ishmael wouldn't have been there according to the Genesis story. I do have an answer to that, but there is a Jewish, which I was put onto by Joe, as it happens. We were mentioning Joe earlier. Joe advised me that Ishmael, there is a tradition that Ishmael was one of the 2 servants of Abraham who was stood at the bottom of the mountain when Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. And so it's not, it wouldn't be a huge departure from scripture for the Quran to suggest that Ishmael might have actually walked up the mountain with his father and helped him with the firewood and building the altar.
Just so you know, Paul, if you were to ask this question of Muslims, who was the one that was supposed to be sacrificed, the majority of Muslims today would say that was Ishmael, that Isaac was not the one to be sacrificed, it was Ishmael. Now, the Quran does not support that. The Quran does not support it. It doesn't say who it was. It doesn't give any name. And if there has been a doctoral thesis done on this by a friend of mine who actually went and looked at all the references historically on all the tafsir. The tafsir would be the commentaries concerning who would be the one that was sacrificed. And he found that all of the earliest exegetes that started from the 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th century, they all said it was Ishmael. By the 16th, 17th century, that was starting to change to Isaac. So that most of your modern exegetes now consider it was Isaac that went up and that it was Isaac that was going to be sacrificed. With that in mind, they then understand why Muslims, this is a real problem. Who is the one? Who was the child? The reason why most of your modern exegetes want Ishmael to be there is because they want him to be in the prophetic line. And this would be understandable because they consider their lineage from Ishmael, not from Isaac.
Yes, it's an interesting subject again. As with Baka and Mecca, I have my own theories, but I don't want to get sidetracked onto them. Clearly, Ishmael is a character who the Quran is more interested in rather than Isaac at this stage. They're very interested in putting Ishmael at the scene of building the altar, but they don't actually say who goes on top of the altar. The Quran seems deliberately vague on the subject. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 16 and 17 describes three feasts that must be carried out at a place that God will provide for the children of Israel, and that place later becomes the Jerusalem temple. And these three pilgrimage feasts, I'm going to murder the language, my pronunciation, but it's called the Hag Hamasot, which is the name for the Passover, the celebration of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. The Hag Sabuot, which is the Feast of Weeks, which is about harvest, as I understand, and the Hag Hasukot, which is the Feast of Tabernacles, also called the Feast of Booths. The common theme, of course, in all these is the word Hag, which is the word for a feast. But the Deuteronomy, these are not just feasts, these are all the pilgrimage feasts. These are all the feasts where one has to celebrate them at the temple, not anywhere you happen to be. And this seems to me that that's a very clear correlation with the Quran's Hajj. I'm no linguist, but it seems to be very, very clear that one could take that hard G and turn it into a soft J. That's something that could easily happen as it changes language.
if you look at the Arabic, they are pretty much the same letter. It just depends on where you put the dot in. And those were only added in the 8th century. So easily you could have one or the other. Yeah, with the earliest manuscripts that were referring to it.
Okay, we are told that the Hajj involves an animal sacrifice. Well, of course, one has an animal sacrifice at the Passover. That's very important for it. We are also told that circumambulation takes place during these festivals, and in both the Feast of Weeks and the Feast of Tabernacles, they both involve, in Jewish tradition, a 7-lap circumambulation. Of course, 7 laps isn't mentioned in the Quran, but the Muslims do walk around the Kaaba 7 times as part of the Hajj pilgrimage, and 7-lap circumambulations are referred to, in the one case, in the Book of Jubilees, chapter 16, verse 31, and secondly, in relation to the Feast of Tabernacles, it's in the Mishnah, in the Mishnah Sukkah 4.5. And the Mishnah, of course, is the oral law that was written down in the oral law that was then reduced to writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries, so long before the Quran. The Book of Jubilees, which people may not be familiar with, is also very, very old, long before the Quran.
I just have to stop in here because this is fascinating what you're bringing up. When you ask Muslims why 7 times, they have no response to that. They don't understand. And most of the ones that I have asked, why is it you're going around the Kaaba 7 times during the Hajj? They said, because Abraham did that. I said, well, then why do you think Abraham did it? What's the significance of 7? And you're bringing it up here. It's because this is the antecedent. 7 is the holy number. That's why you do 7 times. But see, Muslims have no idea that this looks like this is all antecedent. This is all preceded by what you not only see in the Bible, but what you also see in the practices there within Israel, much, much, much earlier.
And finally, going between Safa and Marwa. Marwa is, I think, fairly easily identified as a reference to Mount Moriah, which is the mountain upon which Abraham is told to sacrifice Isaac, and where Solomon built his temple. It all takes place on Mount Moriah, and Marwa seems to me quite easily explained as an Arabicization of that. Safa is a name for the Mount of the Watchmen, sometimes called Mount Scopus, and it's given this name in the book The Antiquities of the Jews, which is written by Josephus, and in a particular context, which I may come on later. It's about the surrender. I'll say it now. It's called Mount Safa in the Antiquities of the Jews in relation to the surrender of Jerusalem to Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC. So it's about a military seizure of Jerusalem. So something which will become very relevant as I move on.
I think, just to jump in here, this is one of the most significant ones you're bringing up right now. You don't happen to have a picture of Jerusalem with Mount Moriah, the Kidron Valley, and also the Mount of Watchmen on it at this point that we could put up?
Now, of course, the Quran doesn't just mention Safa and Marwa as 2 isolated places. It talks about going between Safa and Marwa. And if you went between the 2, you would be crossing the Kidron Valley. The 2 hills are actually quite close to each other, and there's just one valley separating them, which in itself is some corroboration for saying that Marwa and Safa are Mount Moriah and Mount Safa, because these are 2 places that are so close to each other. And the Kidron Valley is in Jewish tradition, this is the valley of Jehoshaphat. And perhaps the significance of this, and in the book of Joel, the valley of Jehoshaphat is the place where God will gather together the nations of the earth for judgment at the end of days. Perhaps if I depict it with a visual representation. This is Jerusalem as an eschatological landscape. You will see in the pretty much the center of the screen, you see Temple Mount, and that is built on Mount Moriah, which I would say is Marwa for the Quran. And you will see in the top left-hand corner, Mount Scopus, which Josephus refers to as Safa. And if you are to cross between the two, you will see the Kidron Valley there. That would be going between Safa and Marwa in the Quran. And we've got a little painting there, little watercolor picture of the valley. Now you will notice another valley called the Valley of Hinnom or Gehenna. I show this. That is the Valley of Gehenna. And in the Hebrew Bible, Gehenna is symbolic of the destruction of the wicked, is referred to as such in the book of Jeremiah, in the verses that I've just put on the screen. And this is also used in the Gospels. In the Gospel of, it's used many times in the Gospels, I think. You would know better than me, I think, Jay, but it's used about 20 odd times, is it, by Jesus throughout the 4 Gospels to refer to a place where the wicked will be destroyed. Yeah. I give an example, Matthew chapter 10, verse 28. Do not fear those who deprive the body of life, but cannot destroy the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both the body and the soul in Gehenna. And this is a reference to this valley to the south of Jerusalem. Am I right, Jay?
Yeah, that's correct.
Well, the Quran uses the word Jahannam 77 times to refer to the hellfire and the destination of the wicked. And it also uses the word Jahim a further 24 times, which is, I think, thought to be a variation of the same root word. So that's 100 references to Gehenna effectively within the Quran. So it looks as though the Quran has bought in to the eschatological landscape of Jerusalem. It doesn't refer to the valley of Jehoshaphat by name, but it does refer to the adjacent valley many, many times as being the gates of hell, effectively. So we know that the Quran author was invested in this particular landscape. The Kidron Valley was Jehoshaphat, the valley of God's judgment in Joel. I've got the quote from Joel here. I will assemble all nations and bring them to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there. Let the nations bestir themselves and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there I shall sit in judgment upon all the neighboring nations. And I have a little quote here from The Apocalypse of Empire by Stephen Shoemaker. In the Islamic apocalyptic tradition, Shoemaker says, the rock of Jerusalem, the foundation stone of creation, according to both Jewish and Islamic traditions, occupies center stage. At the final judgment, God will place God's foot on the rock, and it will be God's throne of glory. Likewise, the angel Israfil will sound the final trumpet from upon the rock, and calling all living creatures to assemble in Jerusalem. East of the rock, in the valley of Jehoshaphat, or Gehenna, hell will open up, reflecting older Jewish traditions, whilst paradise will open up between the Al-Aqsa Mosque to the south. Then Jesus, son of Mary, will return to Jerusalem to defeat the Dajjal, the Antichrist. So the eschatological Jerusalem seems to be central to the Quran author. This is reference to later tradition, but the Quran author himself refers to Gehenna. So he himself talking about this particular landscape. So to summarize the position, the Quran talks about the Masjid al Haram as God's house, Well, that fits with what the Bible tells us about the Jerusalem temple. It tells us it's the first house at Mecca. Well, Mecca is associated with the pilgrimage route to Jerusalem in Psalm 84. It refers to the sacred place as a cube. Well, the Holy of Holies of the Jerusalem temple is described as a cube in 1 Kings. It says it was built by Abraham. Well, the Jerusalem temple is built upon the site where Abraham is supposedly was willing to sacrifice Isaac. It tells us it is the destination of a Hajj pilgrimage involving circumambulation and animal sacrifice. Well, we know that there are 3 pilgrimages to Jerusalem that go by the name Hajj, and these between them involve animal sacrifice and 7-lap circumambulation, which is what Muslims do traditionally during the Hajj pilgrimage. And it talks about Safa and Marwa, and we've shown that these are the names of 2 hills very close together, and going between the 2, you would cross the place that was traditionally the Valley of Judgment, adjacent to the Valley of the entry to the Hellfire. So every attribute of the Masjid al Haram that is referred to in the Quran can be explained by reference either to a Bible verse or to something like the Book of Jubilees or the Mishnah or the Antiquities of the Jews, which is very ancient and comes out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's all references that long predate the Quran, whereas the traditional Islamic narrative relies entirely on things that are completely undocumented and I would say somewhat fanciful and illogical.
Paul, this is exciting. Thanks so much. I think what you have done here is pivotal. It's important, and I hope people are following what Paul has done. If you look and see the Masjid al Haram, remember the Masjid al Haram is all that it refers to in the Quran. We don't know where the Masjid al Haram is. Muslims today, I'd say 99% of all Muslims suggest that it is Mecca. It is where the Kaaba is. It's that central area there in Mecca where the cube, the square building is. That's what every Muslim believes. But it doesn't say so in the Quran. When you look at chapter 2, verse 145 to 150 in the Quran, which refers to the Qibla as being brought down to the Masjid al-Haram, doesn't say Mecca there. When you look at chapter 17, verse 1, which refers that Muhammad was woken up in the middle of the night and put on the back of the winged horse, who flies from the Masjid al-Haram to the Masjid al-Aqsa. We know where Masjid al-Aqsa is, and that's pretty well known. We've just done a video on that. That is in Jerusalem. Isn't that interesting? But Masjid al-Haram, again, every Muslim believes that's Mecca. But what you're saying is, and what I love what you've done here, Paul, you're looking at all the Quranic references, and this is what you are. This is your expertise. You look at themes in the Quran. That's what your book's going to be when you come out. You've already seen this theme over and over and over again. You gave us reference after reference after reference. And then you unpack the ones that have to do with the Masjid al-Haram. That's the thing you want to look at for this episode. And what you've said is there are 6 major areas. There are 6 categories that the Masjid al-Haram referred to. It talks about the first, the house. It talks about the name Mecca, or Muslims consider that to be Mecca. It talks about the cube, that this Masjid al-Haram is a cube, that it's in the station of Abraham, and that there is a pilgrimage, a Hajj, that goes to it, and that there are 2 hills, Safa and Marwa. So you looked at these 6 categories, you really underlined them by showing where they are in the Quran, and then you went, and this is the genius of what you've done. You've then taken those 6 areas, and you say, well, now hold on a minute. Those 6 areas we can find in the Bible. Let's take a look and see. They are all referred to. This is nothing new for us. If we're Christians and Jews, we know the Bible, and let's see what it says. So you took each one of them one by one by one by one. You looked and said, let's find out where it is. And you said, in every case, the house, which is Mecca. In fact, we even have the right Mecca. We have the right name in the biblical context. And the fact that there is reference to the cube and the station of Abraham. You're also talking about the pilgrimage, even the word is there, and the circumambulation 7 times. That's Jewish, folks. Muslims, where do you get that from? That makes no sense in any Muslim theology. Muslims always have the number 3 prayers in the Quran, not 7. Then they get 5 prayers. Another 2 are added in the traditions. Where did the 7 come from? You have to go back to Judaism. You have to go back to the Bible. You have to come back to see the significance of 7. That's the holy number. That's the holy number. And the fact that the pilgrimage and the two of those festivals that you referred to have circumambulation exactly 7 times, which is now been the same that we see now in the Hajj today. But I especially love what you did with Safa and Marwa. And this is, I think, what most people are going to walk away from. When you showed those pictures of Safa and Marwa, and you said, listen, stop and think through, if this is a place where Hagar is running back and forth to get water, and you mentioned that doesn't make sense to go 7 times, unless, of course, you're the number 7 again. Here's that number 7 come up again. But why in the world would she be looking the same place when she's already been there? And these are mountains she's going back and forth with. Muslims today do the same thing. If you go to the Hajj, if you go down to Mecca, Al-Fadi, who lived in Jeddah, he used to do this all the time. He would do it as a lark. They would just get in a car, go 45 minutes, come up to Mecca, because he only lived a few, 30 to 40 miles away. And they would do the Hajj. They would do the running back and forth between Safa and Marwa. But he kept on wondering, these are not mountains. These are nothing more than just little rocks that are 50 to 20 feet high. How can you get water out of rocks? And why would you go back and forth? Because you get water out of mountains. Mountains are where springs come out of, and that's why you look for water where a spring is. But in your case, what you're saying is this still doesn't make sense if she goes back and forth 7 times. If she's already gone there 6 times, why is she going back a 7th? To see the illogic of all this material. And it's illogical, as you mentioned. It is illogical in all the Quranic accounts, but it's absolutely logical when you look at the biblical account. And I love what you did by putting the map out there, because we know where the Marwa and the Safa are. The Safa would be Mount Scopius, which is the Mount Watchman, which you showed there. It is across the Kidron Valley, and that was great to show that map there. The Kidron Valley is right there, and then you have Mount Moriah, that is Marwa, and that Josephus refers to it as Safa for the Mount Scopius. So it is well known by the time, if Josephus is writing this in the 1st to 2nd century AD, then those who are finally bringing it and putting it incorporated into the Quran, you can see then why that became the traditional name for that. Fascinating, because you're saying all of these references that are replete in the Quran referring to this place called the Masjid al Haram, which cannot be placed anywhere because it doesn't say where it is. There's only one place in the Quran which even refers to Mecca. That's in chapter 48, verse 24. What you're saying is it makes sense once you look at Jerusalem. It makes sense once you look at the Bible. It makes sense when you see reference after reference to every one of these 6 different places. These 6 different places that are referred to in the Quran all have their antecedent in the Bible. Well done. This is exciting. Even Gehenna, I didn't expect you to put that in there. The Valley of Gehenna there, that is also the Gehenna. Remember, the G and the J are intersplaceable in Arabic because it depends on where you put the dots. And the dots that weren't there when it was first written down. If you look at the earliest manuscripts, here's one of them right here. The earliest, that's the Topkapi. There are no dots in that manuscript because this is an 8th century manuscript. They were only introduced in the mid to 8th century. So you could put the dots wherever you want to. That's why we have, look at these 9 Qurans. Every one of these 9 Qurans is different because they have dots.
Jay, I don't think that there's anything that I've presented here that by itself is new or some new discovery of my own, particularly with Safa and Marwa, which is Safa, which is the last element. I was helped to that by Odon Lafontaine, who I think you may have heard of.
Our French friend.
My contribution here, my modest contribution, has been to put these 6 together, put them all together. And when you see them together, any one of them, one could explain as a coincidence. Oh, well, there were 2 places known as the House of God. Oh, there were 2 places called Baca. Oh, Abraham built one temple, built an altar where they built one Jewish temple, and then he went somewhere else and he built another altar where there was another shrine built. It's just a common word. You could explain each one of them as a coincidence. You put the 6 of them together, and it's just not possible that they could all relate to the Jerusalem temple, and that nobody would have pointed this out to Muhammad, that he had Jews in his audience, because something like a dozen verses of the Quran are directly addressed to, "O children of Israel." So we know he had Jews there. We know he was, the Quran author was highly motivated by Jewish stories, the stories of Noah and Abraham and Moses and Jesus. The idea that he wouldn't have realized all these factors point to the Jerusalem temple, or that nobody would have pointed it out to him, simply is not believable. And you mentioned yes, you talked about making sense. You said it makes sense. What I find is that when one reads the Quran afresh, and that's the next big challenge, possibly for very many people over many years, but we have got to read the Quran afresh and say, this is based around somebody who is trying to capture the Masjid al Haram, who's telling his people to who's been expelled from the Masjid al Haram, who wants to purify the Masjid al Haram, who wants to recapture it by military means, to fight to regain access to it. And once one thinks of that as Jerusalem, and we tie it in with what was happening in Jerusalem at around the time that the Quran was being written, about the Byzantine-Sasanian War, about Heraclius expelling the Jews, and then you read the whole of the Quran with that in mind, it does make sense. And that's in a way that the traditional narrative just simply, to my mind, doesn't make sense. It's all trying to find explanations, literal explanations for words by fanciful ideas. It doesn't really hang together and make sense in the way that I think I can make the Quran make sense.
Good friend. Listen, this has been excellent, Paul. We're going to end it here. This will be the first of a number of videos that you're going to be doing for Fander Films, and also for your new channel that's going up. Can you tell us what we're going to be doing next? What are the next two things you want to look at?
Right. I want to put the idea that the discovery that the Jerusalem is actually the Masjid al Haram, and put it into context, put it within what the Quran says generally, not just what the Quran says about this one place, but what does the Quran generally say, and what does changing this location from the Hijaz to Jerusalem, how does that require a reinterpretation of everything that the Quran says. You mentioned the night journey. The night journey, we are told in Surah 17, verse 1, that God's servant was taken from the Masjid al Haram to the furthest mosque. Well, on my analysis, that means he was taken from Jerusalem to somewhere far away. Not that it was a journey to Jerusalem, but it was a journey away from Jerusalem. What does that mean? I will provide a theory for that. I will make Surah 17 make sense in a way that I don't think anybody has ever made Surah 17 make sense before.
Okay. God bless you. This has been great. Paul, this is the first time I've met you. I've come across some of your material through Mel. It's so good to have you on board. You're there in London. I'm here in the United States. We're 3,000 miles away, and yet we can still share in this together. We're going to have you back again. We're going to unpack chapter 17, verse 1. We're going to unpack also the word Mahmud, something that Joe has done earlier. You're going to show and explain what this reference one is, the praise one, that altogether lovely, this adjective phrase. You're going to unpack Surah 9 for us, and then you're going to give an overview of why this, what you call the Jerusalem thesis, actually makes sense. Until we come back again, Paul, God bless you. This is Jay.
Thank you very much for having me, Jay.
This is Jay, over and out.